Oh, yeah, no, we got to do that too.
Some of them are actually marginally useful.
Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams, Editor-in-Chief of Hackaday.
And I'm Dan Maloney. I'm a staff writer at Hackaday.com and community engineer at Hackaday.io.
This is episode 176. We'll be talking about freezing warm water, hacking lenses, hearing data, and watching YouTube on a PET.
In the news this week, there were competing headlines for the capstone mission to the moon, which it's not a CubeSat per se. It's a 55 kilogram box. I think everybody's described it as the size of a microwave.
Yeah, what's with that? That was NASA's description. It's the microwave oven size.
The microwave oven. That's the new metric. It's bananas, microwave ovens, football fields. That's how we
bigger than the bread box, smaller than the microwave oven.
That's how we do things now. Yeah. But the first news was that it had been launched, first of all, and then had done the translunar insertion or whatever the moral equivalent is of that for this mission. It was on its way to the moon, and then all of a sudden, the next headline was, hey, guess what? We can't talk to the thing anymore. And I mentioned this in our pitch meeting yesterday, and Tom Nardi actually, he was detectably saddened by this news. He's like, oh. Didn't want to hear that Capstone had gotten into trouble. And for those who don't know, Capstone is basically a discovery mission to test the orbit that's going to be used for the Lunar Gateway, which will be the kind of the staging area, the platform that astronauts will use to get down to the surface of the moon in the next moon landings. And it's going to be in this halo orbit, this, what do they call it? Near rectilinear halo orbit, NRHO. So it's basically going around the moon more or less 90 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic. So it's always in view of the moon and Earth. It's this very, very elliptical orbit. And they're testing basically using this microwave oven-sized satellite to test this all out. And losing contact with it certainly was going to be a problem. But Tom, you can cheer up now. Apparently, they've regained communication with the satellite. So, I don't know, maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was, who knows? Flock of seagulls flying past the antenna. Who knows?
Exactly. Yeah, I love the NASA folks who are like, if needed, the mission has enough fuel to delay the initial post-separation trajectory correction maneuver for several days, which is what you say when you're absolutely flat out panicking.
Yeah.
That's nerves of steel, I think it takes to lose your satellite and not be saying, oh, crap. But it's probably also true that they had, layers and layers and layers of contingency plans. And they're still running the contingency plans. They still got plans. So no worries. And now it's back online. So what are you going to say?
I may be wrong about this, but I seem to remember reading in one of these articles that this mission was going to take the better part of a year to get to the moon.
Yeah.
Or to get into this orbit. And I vividly remember we did that in 3 days in 1969. So
right. Well, you
I'm
can't
not sure
take
why
a year to
so
do
long.
it if you have to feed people on the spaceship. But,
Yeah, but is it now our future missions, manned missions, crewed missions, are they going to be a year in space before they get to walk on the moon for 20 minutes? I don't think so. I think there's probably something else going on here. I need to understand this a little bit better. I think Scott Manley did a video on what this NRHO orbit is all about and how it works and all that. So maybe it's time to review the literature again and see exactly what's going on here.
My favorite funny news this week was Cruise robotaxis blocking traffic in San Francisco. The Cruise is I guess they're GM's autonomous driving division. They're actually really far ahead in terms of getting actual autonomous driving done and have been testing in urban San Francisco for a number of years now and have a permit to run completely driverless taxis at night in San Francisco, which is pretty cool. I mean, these are actual robot cars driving around, picking people up, taking them places. Among their strange behaviors is that they tend to caravan together. And something happened last week where they were in a caravan, 6 or 8 of them, and they just all stopped and completely blocked the street for, a few hours. And according to the company, some of them were able to be moved remotely, and some of them people actually had to go there and drive the cars away. But of course, everybody seeing this happen, like a flock of autonomous vehicles just blockading the street. This is how it begins, folks. No, I think it's really just funny. And between this and the what cops do when a robo-taxi does something wrong, which we saw a few weeks back, there was that marvelous cell phone shot video footage of cops pulling over a driverless car and being like, we gotta see somebody's driver's license here, but who? It's really funny, and it definitely points to growing pains we're gonna have in this kind of transition toward driverless automobiles, if indeed that is the way things are going.
Yeah, I love the little bit at the end. No citation was issued. To who?
Right?
What? Just throw it in the window and it'll drive the ticket back home? What do you do?
This is the big question, actually.
Or even when they just get a flat. What happens then?
Right?
Because that's going to happen.
I bet they have tire pressure sensors and they know when they get a flat.
Probably no, but...
They got to send someone out with a tire jack, I presume.
Yeah. I mean that's probably what happens in 80% of flat tire situations now anyways. Nobody knows how to fix a tire anymore. Yeah. So it's probably not going to be much different than it would if there were a human in there. The human's not going to be able to do anything either. But they're not going to be able to do anything if there's nobody in there, and it's going to have to be dealt with by somebody else.
Makes the next business model robots for changing car tires.
There you go.
We'll make millions.
That's the $1 million idea right there.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound? What's that sound?
All right, shall we head over to What's That Sound?
Yes.
Have you listened to it?
This I have not.
All right.
A new life awaits you in the off-world colony.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That last little bit at the end did it for me.
Yeah.
Yep. Want me to say it?
Please do.
That's from Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because last week was the 40th anniversary of the original Blade Runner movie.
Oh my God.
And so I was like, oh, I have to do something for that.
That means it's been 40 years since I graduated high school. Oh my God.
And a couple people not only got the right answer, but congratulated Blade Runner on its 40th anniversary. We got 42 answers. One of them was wrong, and one of them, he's kind of disqualified himself. So for the 40th anniversary of Blade Runner, we've got actually 40 right answers.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Which I think is delicious. So I'm going to roll a 40-sided die in the form of... I'm going this time to random.org, which is run by Cloudflare. They give you a bunch of random numbers. I'll put the links in the show notes if you ever need random numbers. It looks like a good one. This one's given me one integer from 1 and 40. And the winner is a 28. Let's see who 28 is. Congratulations, Seth. The Streets of Los Angeles in 2019 from Blade Runner.
Good job, Seth.
The number of people who are like, finished the quote for us. A new life awaits you in the off-world colonies. A chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure is pretty awesome. As usual, a bunch of great answers here. A bunch of super huge Blade Runner fans. Congratulations to everybody. I'd like to start off this week with a controversy. Does hot water freeze faster than cold? Debate continues over the Mpemba effect. And this was an article out in Quanta magazine about it was kind of a review of some recent sciencey articles looking into the Mpemba effect. I still don't even know what the effect is, and this is part of what bothers me about this. So I've got a huge science rant coming up, but the popular press version of it is that warm water freezes faster than cold water does if you put it in the freezer. I've done this experiment twice, and I did it again now. And so I've done it now 3 times in my life. And every time the cold water has frozen faster by just a little bit. So I don't know what the Mpemba effect is, and whatever it is, I'm not doing it right. So I would like to hear exactly what the procedure is. What's the protocol that brings forth this effect where warm water freezes faster, because I haven't been able to reproduce it. That said, people have, and whether that's, what that's due to, I have no idea. And again, because there's no established procedure for getting this effect out there, it's really hard to say what's going on. But what I learned from this article was really great. And this is kind of what, I've been told that warm water freezes faster by a lot of people, and it, violates all sorts of thermodynamics, at least if things are behaving as if it was in equilibrium, as if the temperature was the same everywhere in the cup of water that's in the freezer. That, I guess, is kind of what this area of research is looking into, is that maybe, there's more convection in it if it's hotter water, or some people say things about the skin effect being less pronounced if it's hotter water, so it's able to give off its temperature better at the surface, and that makes it, kind of makes it more effective radiator off the surface. And so even if the average temperature is the same as the cold one, it's hotter at the top and colder at the bottom, and that might help it freeze faster. There's all these crazy stories to try to explain it, but what they all have in common is this idea of non-equilibrium temperature, and that is that the temperature here is different from the temperature there. And what I find particularly telling is that the original Mpemba effect was discovered by Joseph Mpemba when he was freezing ice cream. And so he actually had warm ice cream freezing faster than cold ice cream in a freezer. And this is where it makes total sense to me, because ice cream is this weird mix of water and fat and strawberries if you're a good person. And it's a completely inhomogeneous kind of thing. And, even just the way you normally make ice cream, like if you're churning it, right? You're freezing crystals on the outside of the vessel, and you're scraping the outside so that those bits go onto the inside so that you expose new bits to the outside. Ice cream freezing is all sorts of inhomogeneous and bizarro anyway. So this article kind of gets in that direction and starts looking at these people who've looked into the science of this and are trying to say, what's going on here? Maybe a cup of water in the freezer isn't a cup of water. None of them are actually aiming at water as a target, because actually water does come to equilibrium pretty darn easily, and it is pretty homogeneous. So they're looking at, other exotic fluids and things.
I think the thing here is that Mpemba, as a teenager, gets into this situation where basically he's in a rush, and he puts the ice cream in the tray, and the mixture is still hot, and he notices that it freezes first, and he goes to the teacher and says, hey, what's going on here? And the teacher says, you're confused. That can't happen.
Yeah.
Go away, kid. You're bothering me, kind of thing. Okay, fine. You can be that way. But what I'm going to do, he says, is I'm going to go on and study physics and figure out what's going on myself. Is that the right way for a teacher to inspire a student? No, but in this case, it kind of worked.
Yeah, right? That's not the way to do science. If you want to do good science and you get presented with a weird phenomenon, what do you say? You say that can't be true, or you say, hey, wait, that's weird. Let's go figure out what the heck is going on.
I mean, when I was in grad school, I worked in a plant lab, and I noticed something weird. I forget what it was on the tobacco plants that I was growing. We studied tobacco plants, and I noticed this thing, and I mentioned it to the boss, and I said, hey, Duncan, something's going on here. It's weird. And he looked at it, and he was just like, that is weird. Take notes. And that was it.
Thank you.
Take notes. And he just walked away. And I don't know if he ever did anything with the weird observation or anything, but that always stuck with me. That's weird. Take notes.
That's exactly right. Perfect. That's science right there, folks.
Duncan was good. Okay, my first pick is converting a Sigma lens to Canon, digital functionality included. The idea of hacking lenses for me has always been, camera lenses obviously, has always been just fraught with peril. The idea of this seemingly delicate piece of precision optics, and you're going to tear that apart and I always felt like, if I made one wrong move, I'd scratch a coating, or if I tried to free up lenses that have no visible way, or, no instantly apparent way of being attached to the mechanical parts of the lens. It's a very confusing innards. There's, screws and gears and bits and pieces that just seem like they're better off not messed with. I generally am not squeamish about taking things apart. Lenses are kind of where I've always drawn the line. In this case, Dan Kay had decided that he was going to take a Sigma lens. And when I was in photography, Sigma was a manufacturer of kind of aftermarket lenses that were made with a variety of mounts that would fit a bunch of different cameras. And so if you wanted to get a zoom lens for your Canon or your Nikon camera or whatever, you could get a Sigma, which was a whole lot cheaper than an OEM lens. I guess they also made cameras themselves at one point, at least, because he got one of these cameras with a nice lens and played around with it a bit. Eventually, the camera gave up the ghosts. The image sensor went kaflooey. So he's left with this nice lens that didn't fit anything else, any of the other bodies that he had in his collection. And he thought, well, is there going to be a way that I can make this Sigma lens fit on my Canon camera? TLDR, yeah, there is a way to do it. It was not easy, according to his write-up, and the detail that he goes into shows that it's not as straightforward as that. And there's some of those gut check moments, like I would fear, like springs coming out, screws getting lost, ribbon cables for the electrical functions, which the lenses I was working with back then didn't really have a lot of electrical. It just had a couple of basic contacts. But he still managed to get it done with a little bit of work on a lathe, of course. There's always going to be a lathe. When you want to make a precision part, you're going to probably want to put it on a lathe. But he managed to make this ring that adapted the physical part of the mounting bayonet to the Canon camera, while maintaining the connections for the autofocus and the aperture and all that stuff. So all that functionality still works. He's got this nice 15 to 30 millimeter lens that now fits on his Canon camera, and there you go.
The last thing that worked in Dan's favor here, infinite courage, because it was a junk lens anyway. The other thing working in his favor was that because these were meant to go on multiple cameras, because like you said, Sigma made aftermarket lenses, the electronics were the same, and they probably just screwed a different bayonet mount flange thing on the different lenses at the factory and sold them for different camera brands. And so in that sense, he's super lucky here because he doesn't have to redo any of the electronics. He just has to redo the physical part. So this is a hack that you can pull off in the case that you've got some, lenses that match as easily as this one. Otherwise, I think you're going to be in for, an electrical world of hurt in addition to the extreme machining. Well, if you want to know how the video game Mario Kart works from the inside out, this new video series by Mr. L314 looks like it's going to be awesome. So far, there's only one out, and I found it really interesting. He's starting off with how the AI in Mario Kart works. The spoiler is that, back on these old computers, there wasn't much processing. And so the AI isn't very In fact, it's an entirely simple system that makes the competitor cars drive through the maze, avoid each other. They get a lot of really great behavior out of some very simple rules. And he goes through those in this one and hints at some of the extra rules that'll get thrown on top of this in the next video, and I can't wait to see that. But the short version is that ideally you would want each car to kind of know where it is and know where it's going so it could steer in the right direction. And instead of recalculating this on the fly all the time, the maps are made with a bunch of zones that have essentially little blocks in them that say where to drive if you're in this block. So there's kind of a flow field that goes through the maze, through the lap, whichever one it is in Mario Kart. So if Bowser's a little bit to the left, he gets shoved a little bit to the right and vice versa, and kind of follows this flow along. And that accounts for the way the different cars manage to drive around the track. it's not they know where the edge of the track is or anything. It's just all of the track is kind of pre-computed like this. And this trick actually goes way back in video games. I think goes back at least to Atari's Sprint 2 from 1976. There's a great talk about that Hans Frank listed in the comments. You should go check that out too. But the thing that racers in Mario Kart also do is they avoid running into you and each other. And so he goes through how that mechanism works. And that's also really clever because they steer a little bit wider around you on the tracks where you don't fall off the edges, but they steer a lot closer to you on the tracks where if they steered wider, they'd fall off of a cliff and stuff like that. It's really interesting just to see how these extremely simple algorithms can make you think that you're actually like driving against Bowser in a video game.
Progression of it now, seeing, you know, how NPCs operate in something like Skyrim or Red Dead Redemption or whatever, you know, all those things have become a completely different level of AI than this. But these kind of games were perfectly playable for what they were when they were. And you can't knock the lack of eye in the AI. They did what they could. What was this, 25, 30 years ago, right? When
right.
this was a current game. And you think about the change in hardware and
yeah, I just always think it's really cool to look at some of these older techniques because they're, like you said, so much less complicated than the more modern games in a way. Like, I think it's easier to kind of wrap your head around and apply it to, you know, a problem that you maybe have. Like, I was thinking about this one in particular in terms of, when did you have the hack chat with Nick Rame? Was that like last week or the week before? The autonomous flight guidance one.
Oh yeah, that was not too long ago.
And I know he was doing some of the like navigation and obstacle avoidance algorithms he was doing were like, you know, like A-star and stuff like this, you know, which go also kind of way back. And I wonder how, you know, these kind of simple rules could be applied to, you know, instead of Mario Kart, to more interesting things navigating around the real world and your own robot projects and stuff. So I do think that it's worth kind of looking at some of these old solutions because they may be too simple, but if they're just simple enough and they work, maybe it's useful for you in whatever it is you're up to.
Yeah. All right, my next pick is Computer Vision Extracts Lightning from Footage. This is by Liam. It caught my eye because I have a buddy who used to do weather photography, and he had this perfect setup. His house overlooked this valley off to the east, and storms would just march in across this valley. So he could put a camera in the house, like in his bathroom window, set it up there and sit there and wait and click, you know, when he saw a lightning strike up on this hill. And he got a lot of good shots, but he did it all with film cameras. And he got a lot of not good shots, empty frames, and a lot of film wasted. So a lot of it was down to luck. Just being there at the right time with your finger on the trigger and being able to get just the right shot. It happens. Lightning strikes here thousands of times a day. So you figure, okay, you know, it can't be that hard, right? But it is. It's that hard because first of all, you don't know where it's going to hit. Probably makes sense to shoot during a thunderstorm, you know, in general, but even then, what's it going to hit? You think it's going to hit a TV tower and it hits the tree over there. So using a digital camera can make it a whole lot easier. And this is what was going on in this case. Liam is using a digital camera that's basically just taking video. What you do is you point it to the sky toward where you think lightning's going to be and just let it run 60 frames per second. Chances are eventually it's going to get something. The problem is the eventually and the number of frames that you have to wade through to find a good one. The project here takes a folder full of MP4 captures from the camera, does frame-by-frame analysis using a Python script that uses OpenCV to detect differences between frames. If it detects something that's of a sufficient threshold, there's a settable threshold setting and a couple other parameters, then it will kick out the frame that it was significantly different from the previous frame, and you get to review maybe 100 frames or 1,000 frames instead of, you know, do the math at 60 frames per second for a couple of hours worth of capture. Liam has also been able to do kind of some lightning research with this, going into some of these weird forms of lightning, like red sprites and elves. And isn't there one called Steve or Steven or something like that? Some form of lightning that recently discovered. He's managed to capture a couple of those. So that's kind of neat too. Powerful method and actually pretty simple. Shout out to Saulius Luxi and Drake Anthony, who goes as Styropyro on YouTube.
Yeah, this is building off of some old code by Saulius Luxe. We've actually covered that before back in 2015, and this is basically updating it and refining it and stuff like that. Anyway, what's awesome about this is that it uses that same idea and updates it to modern tools. I think the other trick, though, Dan, from old school film lightning photographers is you stop the lens way down and you just use a super long exposure. So you don't try to time it. You just, go for 10 seconds and then you go for 10 seconds and you go for 10 seconds. Granted, you waste a lot of film making a whole bunch of long exposures where lightning doesn't strike. But then when it does, the lightning's so much brighter than the background. If you did it just right, you can get the lightning to show up and it illuminates the background at the same time. Pretty cool. I've seen some awesome lightning photography. I've always wanted to do some myself and never gotten around to it. Does this seem like cheating? I mean, it's just making a video of the whole night and extracting the lightning frames. Is that cheating? I'm almost convinced it is. On the other hand, it makes some really awesome looking pictures. So, maybe I can't complain about that. My next hack is GG Wave Sings the Songs of Your Data. This is a library by Georgy Gerganov for basically everything that has a processor in it. And what it does is it turns audio into data. So it's a modem scheme for encoding data in audio. One of the things I really love about it is the way it's implemented makes it sound kind of a little bit like R2-D2. It's actually got this really pleasing sing-songy chirpiness to it rather than what you think of as the modem noise. Part of the reason it does that is he picked a really interesting encoding scheme that I'll talk about in a sec. But the real point here is that Georgy has written this library not just for big computers that have lots of number crunching power, but also for Arduinos, including AVR-powered Arduinos. He has a native library for the ESP32. He has it written in Python, so it'll run on Windows, Mac. He's got it written in JavaScript, so you can run it on anything that has a browser. And this opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities because you can use audio. If you have an Arduino project with a speaker on it, you can use that speaker to have it send data to your cell phone. Or if you have a project with a microphone that's listening to anything else, you might as well have your cell phone or your computer or a web page or whatever send a little bit of data to it. And you can use this to send config data or, one of the things people always have problems with ESP32s and 8266s is getting them the Wi-Fi credentials on first setup. And that would be a really easy solution for that sort of thing. He does a demo where he just has a couple buttons that when he presses it, it sends out its ID number. And so he can have other devices that are listening for the buttons. And when you press the different buttons, they sing out and the other thing knows that that particular button has been pressed. It just opens up all sorts of really fun kind of interaction possibilities because it works on a whole bunch of different devices. One of the things that I think is pretty cool about this is it's kind of predictably using frequency shift keying. And so, normally you'd be like the old modem stuff. Actually, Tom's secret riddle that he put in last time that used Kansas City standard, I think we're going to talk about that later in the show, uses two tones to encode a 0 and a 1. That's the simplest way you could possibly take it. This one uses 16 different tones, 16 different pitches to represent 4 bits, but then it adds these pitch increments to 6 different bass pitches. And so it sends the first tone based on a lower pitch, and then it sends the next data based on a higher pitch. So if it's a 0, it's just that base pitch, and if it's a 1, it's that pitch plus 1 increment, and if it's a 2, it's that pitch plus 2 increments, etc., etc. And these base pitches then scale up as it goes, and that's what gives it the kind of sing-songy character. It's also really clever because it lets the decoding device know where it is in this 6-nibble packet that gets sent, right? And so you, depending on which bass pitch you're recording, you kind of know where you are, and you know how to put these 4 bits back together to make, I guess, 3 bytes in the end. So you get 6 times 4 is 24. Yeah, 3 bytes worth of data it sends in a ramp up this pitch scale. He also uses a whole bunch of other tricks to make this data come across reliably. So it's all error correction coded up front, and he's actually got a start and stop signal that he sends too, so you can tell when the message is beginning and when the message ends. There's all sorts of reasons to think that this is a pretty stable, pretty usable protocol. The trade-off, I guess, then, is that it's kind of slow, and maybe it's kind of noisy. But he also does a version of it which works in ultrasound. So basically, all the bass pitches are just shifted up to 15 kilohertz, which is not really ultrasound, but it kind of fits. It would probably annoy my son. I don't think I can hear up that high anymore. But cell phones can definitely hear in that range. And so that's part of the reason he uses kind of low ultrasound, I guess. But he also does the same thing, sending the encoded pitches over radio frequency stuff using a hack RF. So, you know, the idea, of course, the protocol, you can put on whatever base frequency you'd like to. Go nuts, right? But in this case, I think it's sweet that it's done over regular speakers, because if the devices are going to be talking all the time, of course, that's going to drive you absolutely insane. But if they're just talking periodically, it might actually be kind of useful to know when they're talking to each other. I'm not sure. The jury's probably still out on this, but I might have to make like a remote control for something based on this protocol.
Okay, my last pick is Blixterm brings full-speed YouTube video to the Commodore PET. Yes, you heard that correctly, the Commodore PET. Now, my first, quote-unquote real computer was a C64, so I knew what the PET was, and I think we actually had some in my high school. And I always thought it was kind of it was a neat computer, but I kind of felt like it was a toy at the time, although we didn't really have much to compare it to. But still, it has a huge following in the retro computer circles. So when you see it pop up in a project like this, it's not unexpected that someone is trying to take a PET and expand it, extend it, enhance it kind of thing. But this one is interesting. First of all, the machine itself is a very curious looking version of the PET that was apparently a rebadged computer was strictly for the Swedish market. It's quite a nice looking machine. I'm really surprised how good it looks.
Is that why it looks so weird? It's like swoopy and retro futuristic in a way that the old ones were.
It doesn't.
In my memory, they're like. They're very funny boxy, angles, but they're boxy. Yeah. It's all, it's sharp edges.
Yeah, and that chiclet keyboard that was just appalling, if I'm thinking of the right machine. I think I am. Anyways, doesn't strike you as a machine that you would be watching YouTube videos on, for sure. Even with its kind of cool look. Did take a little help to get here with the Raspberry Pi. The Pi really is basically just for downloading videos. You can input the URL for the video and it will go fetch the video. And it does a lot of work processing the video, changing it from its current state that you would watch it on, YouTube on your phone or something like that. It grabs each frame. I think it down converts them and then does a 80 by 20 array of PET ASCII characters that correspond to approximately the shapes on the grayscale shapes that are on the screen. So if you remember, the PET ASCII had all these, they weren't really sprites, but they had all this huge extended character set that are all kinds of interesting non-standard characters. Put those all together on the screen in the right order, and you can replicate sort of a grayscale or a monochrome video. It's kind of like dithering at the character level rather than dithering at the pixel level. The hack required putting a card in that had some dual port SRAM on it so that the Pi could dump its 80 by 25 arrays of characters on one side, and on the other side, the PET can slurp them up as it needs them. And the rate that it needs them is almost in excess of what the PET can do in order to get 30 frames per second onto the screen. There's only time for about 4 or 5 machine instructions to process each byte worth of data. So there's a lot of work that this thing has to do. And there was obviously a lot of optimization that, oh boy, I'm going to try to pronounce his name, Thornborn Yamander, maybe. Sorry if that's incorrect, but he had to do a lot of work to get this to be optimized. And it looks good. I mean, obviously it's not something you'd want to sit down and watch an evening's binge watching with, but it's clearly recognizable what's going on the screen. 30 frames per second is more than sufficient for good, smooth motion. So what, it's in black and white, or actually in this case, black and green. It looks great. And I just thought this was a really clever way to bring something new to the old computers. My only complaint is, no audio? What did the Pets not have that awesome audio chip, or was that later on with the
it didn't.
With the
I don't even know if the computer had audio.
Okay, so we'll give him a pass on that
Mr.
one.
Complainy.
No, we'll give him a pass on that one.
You know, he can't talk about how he did this without going into the internals of the PET computer. And of course, it's one of these old retro computers. And so he shows a block diagram of it. And like, the block diagram of this computer is less complicated than the block diagram of like a microcontroller you're used to using. It is just like, there's not a lot going on in here. And that makes this hack kind of, I mean, it's got a Raspberry Pi on one side, but then it goes low level really quick. And you mentioned that SRAM interface, and that goes into this parallel port that is the kind of the only free port he had left on the computer. I'm not a PET monster. It doesn't have direct memory access, so to get the data out of there into the CPU needs to go fetch the data off this parallel port and throw it into video memory and stuff. It's really a tremendously accessible machine, and I think it's cool kind of the way he does this really low-level hack. And I think that's kind of the point of a lot of retro computing for people. Computers like my desktop computer are just completely magical, but then these kind of super early computers are actually comprehensible, even if you're, not a wizard. So I thought that was really cool about this project, is that he was able to do the kind of super low level stuff simply because it is a retro computer and it was built in a simpler time. My first quick hack this week comes from WYSIWYG Protogen. LCD screen windows are this summer's hottest case mod. This is a really cool effect. He's got a computer that's lit from the inside with, all the bling and glowy fans and all that stuff that you've got. He replaces the glass window on the side of it with the LCD glass minus the backlight. And so basically you've just got this black/moving opaque overlay over the internals. And when you put really cool graphics on it, it makes for a marvelous effect. And it's just kind of a reminder that LCD screens, while we're used to seeing them backlit, they're actually windows that you're able to put crazy graphics on and open to all sorts of fun hacks. Next up, Jacob Geigler with UART Can't Arduino CAN Serial CAN. This is a sweet little hack. It's based on the realization that CAN bus devices have device addresses, and you can make your microcontroller using its hardware CAN bus peripheral pretend to be multiple different devices at the same time, and each of these opens up a separate serial communication over CAN bus to his main computer. And so he's got like a debugging channel and a data channel going to it. I just think this takes advantage of the multiple addressing kind of networking nature of CAN bus to push data out from a microcontroller in a particularly big computer-friendly way. And last up, one of Hackaday's own, Chris Lott with dual power supply in a pinch. This is another really simple hack, but kind of a reminder that USB power delivery is a cool thing. His real power supply was out on loan, and so he needed a couple different voltages and had USB power delivery adapters on hand. USB PD relies on a device to negotiate the voltage that the power adapter gives out. And so what he's doing here is he's basically taking these little USB PD trigger devices and rewiring them so that they give out exactly the voltages he needs. And then boom, he's got a dirt cheap, dirt simple power supply. I think there's a whole bunch of other cool tricks you could do with these in terms of, getting them to ask for more power, less power. Or you could turn it into a variable power supply of a little bit more performance. But in this case, he just needed 5 volts and 20 volts real quick. He moved some solder jumpers around and bam, got the voltages he needs.
My quick hack picks are beginning with a GPS frequency standard for when the timing has to be right by land boards. What got me about this one was the fact that there's nothing but modules in here. Everything is sort of an off-the-shelf module that you can get, and you probably have in your junk box right now. Based on a GPS module, standard GPS receiver module. There's a Cutie Pie breakout board with, I believe there's an SAMD on there, and then a pulse generator module, right. It required a few modifications to get it to work, but basically this thing takes GPS signal in and gives you a 10 megahertz signal out, and it's supposed to be rock solid. I like the fact that it's nothing but modules. You can put this together jiffy quick on a breadboard, or as land boards did, throw it into a little case and have a nice little bit of kit for your lab bench. Next up is M. Caldera with testing a tube without a tube tester. It used to be that there were tube testers in every drugstore in the country. You could take all the tubes out of your old TV when it wasn't working and plug them into this tube tester one at a time. It would tell you, yeah, you need to buy this one, or yeah, you can, this one's okay. Strangely enough, most of them ended up being bad, and they just happen to have a supply of them in the cabinet right below the tube tester. I guess that's how marketing works. In this case, testing is complicated by the fact that, first of all, you have to understand how tubes work, which is not always intuitive to someone who grew up working with silicon instead of glass. A couple of multimeters are going to be needed to do this, and luckily, like Al pointed out, multimeters are cheap, so it won't be much of a problem to cobble together this test setup. And some way to generate the high voltage. A DC to DC converter would be more than sufficient to get the higher voltages needed for the B+ testing. Plus, you need standard stuff like a regular bench power supply that could maybe do the heater current and stuff like that. High voltage is not always necessary to test a tube. However, I'll put a link in the show notes to a lower voltage application for tubes that has grown into this massive vacuum tube computer that our friend David is working on, Usagi Electric there. You want to check that out. And he's put together a tube tester too that is used at lower voltages, lower B+ voltages, and 24 volts I think is what he's using. So not every tube needs to be tested at high voltage, but it's nice to know how to do it when you need to do it. The last one is never miss an email again with this 1970s style desktop notifier by Pierre Muff. This one I like for a lot of reasons, but the number one reason is the look. This thing is great. It almost looks like the little communicator console gooseneck attachments they had in the original Star Trek, the pilot, before Shatner came along and before Kirk came along. They had these great little things that went up on these gooseneck arms. This kind of reminds me of that. It's got the guts of a Garmin smartwatch inside, plus a beautiful little 128 by 64 pixel VFD display that puts up some really nice little graphics. It's got a clock, calendar, plus notifications when they come in. And the case, it's got a very 70s vibe to it, in bright orange too, to go along with the whole 70s theme.
All right, that brings us to the can't miss segment of the show. These are long form articles written by our fantastic Hackaday writers. This week I picked Lewin Day's 3D printed cartilage ushers in era of custom body parts. Oh, the horrible puns. But this is really interesting medical science. And basically, what's going on here is that some people are born with a congenital defect where the cartilage that forms the outside of their ear doesn't form right. And so they end up with kind of a shriveled looking ear there. And the question is, can you 3D print a cartilage framework and then insert it in under the patient's skin and have their skin grow back around it, giving them at least an ear-shaped looking thing, if not a functional ear on that side? I guess it's cosmetic surgery, right? It makes them not look so strange to other people who aren't used to it. I think this is awesome because 3D printing and medicine has been one of those promises for the past 10, 15 years, and we're finally starting to see this, which I would call baby steps toward a reasonable application going into clinical trial. And they're starting with, as you do, the easiest stuff. I think one of the tricky parts in 3D printing bio anything is making sure that it gets blood flow so that the cells can continue living, and that it gets nervous tissue if it needs to have feeling and stuff. I mean, some of this is just still sci-fi at this point in time. But here they're starting with something that's fairly easy to grow up, like cartilage. And so they take a little sample of that person's cartilage and they grow it up to a whole bunch of cartilage material, which they mix up with some other biomatrix, and then they basically 3D print out of a 3D print syringe printer. They then have kind of an ear-shaped cartilage framework that then they can surgically implant back in the person. It's their own cells, it's their own cartilage just grown up, so the body hopefully won't reject it. This is all like cutting-edge stuff right now. And it is, in terms of, like, I don't know, what the breathless press says about, they'll be 3D printing new livers for people next week. It's not even close to that. This is really just a first step, but it's awesome to see it actually becoming a reality at the same time.
The important thing here, I think, is that growing an ear, obviously, if you don't have one, if you've got a deformity or you've had an accident or something like that, it's going to be a huge impact on your quality of life. So I'm not trying to minimize that, but an ear replacement is something you would probably never do in the traditional transplant way, because you would necessarily have to be on immunosuppressant drugs. And that's going to have a huge impact on the rest of your life. You're going to have to be careful about infections. You're going to have to run the risk of cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To do that for an ear, as impactful as the cosmetic surgeries can be, wouldn't make a lot of sense. I don't know too many doctors who would probably, they probably wouldn't advise you to do that, because It's not functional, not life-threatening. They'd probably say, look, the immunosuppressant thing is going to be too much of a problem to get away with. Even like my daughter with diabetes, she could technically have a pancreas transplant, but she'd be on immunosuppressants for the rest of her life. So what's the choice? Immunosuppressants or insulin? She's going to have to take something for the rest of her life. So let's not do that. Let's not go there. But with this, because it's the patient's own cells and because they're based on the shape of the other ear, and all of this is sort of, this is an autograft, an auto transplant, and this is all the patient's own tissue, then you eliminate that and you take away that barrier to experimenting with this kind of stuff. You now have made a big impact on the patient's life, but it also enables, like you said, now maybe we can experiment with more functional transplants. Maybe we start looking at livers and pancreas, or maybe even before that, maybe we start looking at, because we're dealing with cartilage here, maybe we start looking at growing your own knee replacements.
I went looking at this company's website and what they have in the pipeline, and they're starting out with the ear because it's kind of easiest. It's external largely. Their next target is a nasal defect one. So they're looking at replacing cartilage in your nose. They have in the kind of R&D pipeline lumpectomy breast reconstructive product they're looking at. But like what I think is really interesting here, and kind of both much more useful in terms of number of cases per year, and also, human suffering is they're looking at doing things like knees and herniated disc replacements.
Oh, wow,
And
yeah.
so they're looking at other places where, kind of custom cartilage might be really useful. And that is, if you think about the number of people who have herniated discs and then suffer extreme pain from having their nerves pinched, at least according to their website, these are in preclinical trials yet. So, don't hold your breath on this, but it's the next 5 years we might even see this happening. And then when you talk about organ systems, they're also looking into that, but they're still in the R&D phase. And at least my understanding of the current state of kind of 3D printed organs is that they're just now getting to the point that they can work out some like vascular structures, a little bit of framework to get kind of veins in there. But that stuff is really, really cutting edge right now and won't be seen in medical use for I don't know how long, a while.
Yeah, definitely. But you got to take the first steps, and
Yep.
this is a great way to do it. I think you're gonna impact some people's lives positively, hopefully, and you're gonna develop the technology. We've seen sci-fi stuff come around stuff that even in the 1960s, things that were predicted by Star Trek, we still we see nearly those things are in common use today, some of them. And who's to say that 100 years from now that we won't be printing new limbs in place. Okay, my pick for Can't Miss Articles this week is Tom Nardi's Unraveling the Hackaday Podcast Hidden Message. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the show, but basically it was a case of when the boss is away, the mice will play, and
Tell you what.
or the mouse. Let's just, we're going to let this one go on Tom. He didn't discuss this at all with the rest of us. Although if he had, we would all say go for it, because this sounds like it was kind of a blast to do, and
For sure.
the result was great. The start of it was the previous podcast before Elliot went out on vacation was them talking a little bit about the possibility of encoding something in audio in the podcast. Putting data in audio is something we've been doing forever. We were just talking about that with the little R2D2 tweety tweets. We've all heard modem tones. We know what data sounds like when it's in audio format. So doing that in an analog format is trivial. It's done all the time. But what would happen if you were going to take that analog or that digital analog message and put it through a whole bunch of other digital steps, like processing for the podcast, like encoding it as an MP3, putting it out for distribution on Spotify and the other hosting sites? Is that encoding going to survive through to the end user or the listener so it can be decoded? Those were all kind of unknown questions that Elliot and Tom discussed on the podcast, or maybe it was one of the things that got left on the cutting room floor. They went down this kind of rabbit hole, and once Elliot went away for vacation, Tom said, what can I do here? And he began playing with it. And it turned out that as you would expect from the previous discussion, the easy part was actually encoding the secret message. And full disclosure, I don't know what the secret message is. I haven't actually decoded it myself. But basically what Tom did was use the Kansas City standard, which was from years and years ago. It was a standard that was used for when cassette tapes were the thing for storing your mass storage for your programs. The 300 baud standard. The thing that I remember about it was the photo in the article shows a vinyl record that could be printed up and placed in a magazine. I used to see those all the time. And
Right.
you could actually, put that on a phonograph, a turntable, and there's always this little spot for put penny here if record slips. So you'd weight down you'd weight it down on the turntable and then just put the stylus on and play it and capture that audio instead of having to type in a program from a listing in the magazine. You could actually, feed it right in. Tom chose Kansas City Standard for the encoding and mashed it together with a little bit of backtracked audio, which I recognized instantly because you have to have backtracked audio if you're going to embed a secret message. And then
Right.
there's this burst of data, and he's got a sample in the article, and it's a kind of a headphone warnings kind of thing where if you play it, it's gonna blow you out. Now, what was gonna happen to that after it runs through Elliot's super duper audio processing script was a question that remained. And a lot happened to it. The waveforms, the Audacity waveforms look nothing like each other. It really boosts the backtracked audio section, but the data section, which just showed up as straight square wave looking bar, turned into something completely different. And the reason I picked this is because I wanted Elliot to be able to geek out on what that script is and what it does, and tell us once we make these recordings what happens on his end. It's always been sort of a black box to me. It's always been a mystery. So I was kind of hoping to get a little bit of inside information on what the scripts do and how they process us to make us sound reasonably intelligent. For now, take it away, Elliot. What do these scripts do?
You guys blame me for that. It's horrible. It's actually pretty straightforward stuff in the end. I mean, the first trick to making sure things sound basically all the same is you kind of make sure they're all the same volume. And one of the first things I do is just kind of get all the volume levels kind of in the same ballpark with each other. If you look at that picture of his of these waveforms where he has the like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz and then the data, he's got something that's relatively quiet and then something that's absolutely full scale. And so he's coming into my post-processing scripts with something that's so horribly wrong. Like, they can't even do anything right with it. And you wonder why they mangled it. My God. But then that said, what everyone does these days for podcasts and YouTube videos too, I think, is compress them a little bit, because people tend to be listening on cheaper headphones or in the car or whatever, and you just don't have all of that dynamic range. And so what actually the script does is kind of runs a long attack decay compressor on things and kind of aims to get the audio all at about the same right level. And so what you see in his data is that it comes in, it's like really quiet, and then it goes really tremendously loud. And what the compressor is doing there is it's taking that really loud part and it's kind of squeezing it down. And then because it's at a constant high loudness, it's like squeezing it down more and more and more over time. And so it's like doing this like slow release compressor limiter thing on it. And it's like squeezing it on down. Anyway, this stuff's all just FFmpeg stuff. My scripts aren't that tricky at all. And in fact, when we started doing the podcast, I was looking around to see how loud other podcasts are, because I had this choice in the end, like how loud should I make it and how much dynamic range can we have and what do people do? So I actually went and looked at a whole bunch of well-produced professional podcasts. I think I took Radiolab from NPR as my gold standard because I really like the way Radiolab sounds. And I just ran 2 or 3 different Radiolab episodes through a metering script. And actually I use LUFS, which are these funny, perceptually relevant loudness standards. It's what all the pros use these days instead of VU meters. Everybody's using LUFS. And so I ran a bunch of Radiolab through these LUFS meters to see both, like how loud they go, but also what their quietest quiet is and how much dynamic range they use. And I really, frankly, just copied their numbers straight off, and I do exactly what they do and then run that off to mastering. Later, I found out that YouTube and some of the other podcast sites recommend something that's very close to what we end up doing anyway. So maybe if I'd just, read the manual instead of going and experimenting, I would have figured that out too.
RTFM.
But what I do find interesting about this is how resilient the Kansas City Standard is to being, turned into an MP3 and put out at a low bit rate from whatever these different podcast syndication networks are doing to it.
Kudos to Tom for doing the necessary checks before publishing it, before putting it out on any of the services.
Yeah, right?
He did the decode in a number of different ways. I was pleased to see there's actually a Perl tool for decoding Kansas City Standard. As an old Perl programmer myself, I thought that was great. But there's also a Python library, I guess. It survived despite its compression or whatever. Now the question is it going to survive publication? Are they going to somehow detect that there's a secret message and edit it out? Because that would be bad. Or maybe it's, an attempt to get malware onto a person's machine through a podcast. Short answer, no. That nobody seems to care.
Of course not.
Tom's line, once you open the door with dinosaur erotica in the Kindle store, you've pretty much fully committed to letting folks do whatever they want.
There's dinosaur erotica?
And now I've got a thing I got to go do. So got to go find out about this. But yeah, it came across, and it was decodable enough for someone to figure out what the message was.
I mean, the beauty of Kansas City Standard is really that it is just 2 tones, and it's at a fixed baud rate. It had to be really simple because it had to survive consumer cassette players of the 1970s.
Yeah.
Like, imagine a worse medium here, right? Like, these are cassettes that, especially me as a kid, I've recorded over the same cassette over and over again. So who knows what layers of, like, crusty other sounds are already on this tape. And then you put it in there and it's got warble. And so, like, those motors don't turn reliably at a constant speed. So there's going to be some, like, already some going on.
And the flutter, yep.
Exactly. And you've got to get this. So the pitches they chose for Kansas City, I think, are like factor of 2 apart. One of them is 2400 hertz and the other is 1200. So it's, even if your cassette player is going row row row, it's going to be able to tell the difference between, a factor of 2 in the pitch. Kansas City Standard is really cool in and of itself, and I'm stoked that Tom chose that to encode his secret message in.
I think it might be fun to try to decode it without using any of those libraries. Like, just do it by inspection.
You easily could.
Take it into Audacity and just look at the waveform and say, okay, this is a 1, this is a 0, and just write it down and move on to the next one. Someone in the comments made a really good suggestion about using slow scan TV for a future embedded message.
Ooh.
So we could include a little audio blip somewhere. Actually, it would probably be a pretty long audio blip somewhere in the message, and you could maybe get a picture of something, and some secret hidden message picture. That ought to be interesting. We're gonna try that at some point. I'll put a link to what slow scan TV is. It's basically the ham way of transmitting TV, basically still frame images just using audio.
That's about it for this week's Hackaday podcast. If you'd like to write to us, feel free. editor@hackaday.com. Done anything cool or you see anything cool, send us a tip. tips@hackaday.com. As usual, all the links are in the show notes, hackaday.com/podcast. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
See?
Nice.
Wow,
that was stupid. Don't even put that in.
I'll redo all that. There's something wrong on the internet. Computer vision. All good on that one.
Let me get some water.
I can't tell what language I'm speaking.
All right. Hit the big stop button now.